In several previous videos, I have debunked the claims usually put forward by skeptics about astrology. But there are certain issues with astrology that do need to be addressed. There are certain elephants in the room that are a valid criticism of astrology itself. Now, one of the most often heard arguments about astrology is that it's not universal. It is quite different in its Western form, in its Vedic form, and in its Chinese form, and even its Mayan form. There are significant differences in how it is seen and the symbolism that each system uses. Now, in the past, there were several attempts to explain the differences, why they are there, and they are usually reliant on certain metaphysical principles, not on actual facts. This is, of course, insufficient when it comes to addressing criticism of astrology because, let's be honest, metaphysical facts cannot be verified. Now, something that can be verified, which is quite interesting, is the tendency of both the ancient Mayans and the ancient Egyptians to view Venus, not Mars, as the planet of war. Now, that was something that was discussed even back in the days of ancient Greece. And it is something that should be noted because it is far from insignificant. In fact, this shows you that there is some universality in astrological symbolism. But putting such similarities aside, one can clearly see that in the West, one uses the tropical zodiac, while in the East, the most prevalent zodiac is the sidereal one. And even when we are speaking about the sidereal zodiac, there is some confusion about how to calculate it, because there are several different ways to calculate where it begins and where it ends. Now, to the layman, this doesn't seem like a huge issue, but it does directly affect the interpretation of the entire chart. So there were quite a few battles waged between the proponents of one zodiac over the other. Because let's be honest, only one of them can be correct. Otherwise, the whole system doesn't make any sense. Why would the house rulership work in both systems? It shouldn't. And in reality, it doesn't. You see, most of the users of the tropical zodiac don't use the equal house system, but most of the users of the sidereal zodiac have no problem with using the signs as houses. In addition, the aspects used in Western astrology are quite integral to the interpretation of the chart, but they are completely unnecessary in Vedic astrology. Basically, almost no one uses them, although there is the concept of Bhavat Bhavam, the house from house, which is basically the same idea, only interpreted slightly differently. In addition, there are some very important variations in terms of how Western astrology sees the relationship between planets and several other factors. So it's not as if they are completely compatible with each other. There are slightly different systems working in parallel. Now, another thing that is almost unheard of in the Western tradition is the concept of house lord in certain houses. It's not that it doesn't exist, it does exist, but in Vedic astrology you have very strict rules about the meaning of such position with everything being considered a yoga or a dosha, as in a combination of an affliction, etc. Basically, you have people memorizing actual poems which consist of these positions and what they mean. No one does that in Western astrology. Every interpretation is unique to the chart. When all of these things that I've just mentioned are considered, one can clearly see that these are not the same system. They are used differently. And when you check what exactly the differences are, it is clear that they are exactly what you would expect when the houses are changed. One system clearly favors the aspects over the houses. One system clearly favors a different type of interpretation. The other system is far more rigid, far more specific in positions. It uses full houses instead of the house cusps system, and it has far less flexibility in its application. Now, that doesn't mean that one of them is correct and the other isn't. What it does mean is that they are used differently, and that is why they both are capable of producing results. When you think about it, if you use Western astrology just as it is structured, well, you don't see a problem with that. In fact, you see quite successful predictions when using that system. And when you use Vedic astrology just as described, again, you see great success in interpretation of birth charts and in predictions. So it's not like one system is superior to the other. It's like two different languages. And that language analog can also be seen in the system which is called Gemini astrology, whereby you can use a completely different interpretation system yet still achieve the same results. In addition, there is an actual tropical system practiced in India to this day, which is the Tajika system. Now, if one zodiac was clearly superior to the other, they wouldn't have used both at the same time, but they do. The difference is that the Tajika system is designed for annual horoscopy, for a yearly cycle, predicting what will happen in a specific year, not for interpreting the entire life of an individual. And when you think about what the tropical zodiac actually is, it's the cycle of the sun, the yearly cycle. So it makes perfect sense to use the tropical system when you are analyzing the cycle of the sun. In fact, whenever you analyze the sun, it makes perfect sense to use the tropical system. But the sidereal system is not negated by its use, because the rest of the planets don't follow the same cycle. Now, when you consider all of these things, it becomes clear that the tropical and sidereal zodiac are not competing with each other, they are doing different things. And when you consider them as different, again, for example, different languages instead of 2 plus 2 equals 4, then the picture becomes much clearer. It becomes quite easy to use both more appropriately. For example, perhaps it's not the best idea to consider the position of the sun, or a sun chart with the sun being the ascendant, through the eyes of a sidereal zodiac. Perhaps it will be far wiser to use the tropical one to consider its effects. But that's just one problem addressed. Now let's get to another issue which is often mentioned, which is No interpretation in astrology can be done in a vacuum. What do I mean by that? Well, when you have a certain culture with certain practices, it will produce different results for a given horoscope than another culture with its own practices. For example, if there is a high birth rate among a population, then you can consider the third and 11th houses more important because there is a higher likelihood of brothers and sisters. But in a population where there are basically a maximum of two children, like in most Western societies, you see planets in the third and the 11th as being far more influential, producing a much higher likelihood of siblings. The same can be said about places of work. When one is considering a career, it is extremely important to know which country he resides in because that will basically determine how to interpret his chart. There are also culture specific interpretations. For example, the concept of Ishtadevata will be completely foreign to the Western world. Although there is the concept of guardian angel, it is not something that most people are interested in or care about in the daily life. With all of that being said, there is a branch of astrology dealing with the horoscopy of nations, of countries. And that branch of astrology can definitely shed light on why is the interpretation so different in different cultures. When one considers the ability to overlay one chart over another, for example, the chart of two individuals when you are doing matchmaking, or the chart of the country with the chart of the individual, one can clearly see that the personal karma, shall we say the personal horoscope, is always intermingled with the surroundings, with the circumstances, with the country he is in. This can also be seen quite clearly in the success people have when they leave their home country, while others are quite successful in that country. So it's not like everyone has to migrate to be successful, and it's not like everyone who is migrating will be successful. So there is something to be said about checking the horoscopes of both the individual and the country and doing a sort of matchmaking to see how will that individual fit in. A more interesting aspect of the same problem will be differences in technology. For example, if we are talking about flight, well, that's a fact on the ground which only appeared quite recently in our history. It's something that didn't exist 150 years ago. Now, if we're talking about cell phones, again, not a thing before about 30 years ago. So, what's going on here? How can we combine such technologies with a system of interpretation which is quite ancient? Well, in the West, there is the concept of updating everything, but to be honest, it's not such a huge update when you look at the underlying symbolism of each planet, each sign, etc. You see, the ancients that actually developed the idea of astrology knew that it's not enough to assign only certain rulerships to a certain planet. They designed the system to be not about rigid constructs, but about concepts. Now, the concept of Mercury as the communicator will actually encompass the cell phone as well. It will also encompass the internet. It doesn't need an update. It is already built in. When it comes to vehicles, you have Venus. Now, does it matter if we are talking about a horse, a chariot, or a private jet? Not necessarily. It will still be a luxury item, which is both beautiful and comfortable, and is designed to get you from point A to point B in comfort. So when it comes to the times, the technology, etc., as you can see, the interpretation is not really in need of an update. It's quite flexible to begin with. There are several other concepts which we need to address, but that would make this video far too long. So let's just address the last of the very important issues which are not easily resolved, and that is the accuracy of an astrologer's predictions and also how binding those predictions are. In other words, can you change your future? Now, this question is known as determinism, the idea that you either have a fixed future or a malleable one, which you can change. And here you have a very direct clash between the East and the West, because in the East, the concept of fixed karma is far more prevalent than in the West, where the idea of free will is far more prevalent and far more crucial to the cultural construct. Now, to be honest, when discussing karma and the ability to change one's future, it's not something that can be tested. It's not something that can be verified by independent means. So it's not something that is easily addressed. Overall, the one thing that we do have statistics for is that even the best astrologers are sometimes wrong in their predictions and do sometimes make mistakes. These mistakes can be quite severe, actually. So they should be noted. Now, the ratio of successful to unsuccessful predictions varies according to the astrologer, how much experience does he have, and what knowledge does he possess. But that's beside the point. The point is that the astrologer can always be wrong. So, no matter what the prediction, it can be incorrect. Sometimes it won't occur. With that in mind, one shouldn't panic when faced with a problematic prediction, shall we say. In fact, sometimes those problematic predictions are the result of your own karma playing a trick on you. For example, think about the grandfather paradox. If you would go back in time and kill your own grandfather, you shouldn't be born, right? Well, the same can be said about an incorrect prediction. If you act upon it to change your own fate, well, then the result is still achieved. You still have fulfilled the karma intended, which is quite interesting, but that's a philosophical concept, not something, again, which can be verified. But with the fallibility of the astrologer in mind, one can always say, okay, let's say I have a pretty grim fate. It doesn't mean that it will happen. And when put like that, you can always try to change it. The best known example of this principle is in the case of Yogananda. You see, he specifically stated that he tried to avoid the fate that was in store for him by becoming an ascetic instead of marrying and suffering loss. Now, whether or not this was the correct choice, he was successful in not suffering the loss of several wives, which was predicted to him. This is far from the only example of this concept being applied, and it does make one wonder whether or not it is the correct choice when faced with an inauspicious chart. But that's up to the individual. If the karma must occur, it will occur. If it can be avoided, it will be avoided. Or at least, that's the idea. The best approach to the entire issue is actually outlined in the Bhagavad Gita, where it says that we are responsible for our actions, but not for their results. So just do what you must, and the consequences are not up to you anyway. In future videos, I hope to address the other important issues surrounding astrology and everything that it offers us and everything that is wrong with it. Until then, you are welcome to check out my other videos, and you are also welcome to check out my website. You will find the link below. Thank you.